One of the cooler parts of being a securities lawyer, are there any cool parts, is assembling the glossy annual report. You get to work out your creative half, if they let you work on this report at all. Today on Zippy Point. I'm Brock Romack and I'm a big fan of yous. Before I bring in our guest to explain the glossy annual report in greater detail, let me start by explaining what this thing is. For starters, it's printed often on glossy paper. That explains the fancy name. The glossy annual report is sometimes confused with the Form 10-K because that's also called an annual report technically. But to those in the business, people typically mean the glossy annual report when they use the term annual report. So to explain this more clearly, let's think of it like this. Most companies draft 3 documents for the proxy season: a Form 10-K, a glossy annual report, and a proxy statement. The 10-K is not delivered to shareholders, it's just filed with the SEC. In comparison, unless the company incorporates information into the Form 10-K, the glossy annual report is required by the proxy rules to be delivered to shareholders, and it's considered merely furnished to the SEC, not filed. We're going to explain a little bit more about that later. And then you have the proxy statement. That's both delivered to the shareholders and filed with the SEC. So the glossy annual report and proxy will be delivered typically almost always at the same time to shareholders. Under Rule 14A3A, the proxy must be delivered concurrently or before the glossy annual report. Sometimes a company will have just 2 of these documents if they use a Form 10-K wrap. There definitely is quite a big trend in that direction in recent years, and I'll explain what a 10-K wrap is in a separate Vid-Guide, a link to which is beneath this video. So it's the glossy annual report and proxy that are delivered to shareholders before the annual meeting. That's why they tend to be gussied up. They look pretty. And the 10-K, which is not delivered, often looks rather staid. What to disclose? Rule 14A3B lists all the disclosures that are required to be included in the glossy annual report. This rule pulls from both Regulation SK and Regulation SX. So Regulation SX governs the form and content of financial stuff, the financial statements that are included in the annual report and some other financial metrics. Regulation SK governs other types of disclosures that lawyers typically deal with. But it's a bit odd that the required disclosure for proxies is set forth in Schedule 14A, which is basically like a blank form. And then the Form 10-K has the Form 10-K, which is another blank form. And then you come to the glossy annual report, which has this sub-item of a rule as its form. So that's how confusing the securities laws can get. This disclosure stuff is maddening sometimes. I don't know why the SEC did that, but it did it a long time ago. Okay, so there's essentially 5 different types of things that are required to be in a glossy annual report. Let's go through them. First, you have the big item, the financial and financial related information. This is the stuff where your controller, your CFO, your independent auditors are heavily involved. They're usually driving the bus for the glossy annual report in these areas. It's got the MD&A, the lawyers will be involved in that, the selected financial data, some supplementary financial stuff, market risk disclosure, and then the actual financials are in the glossy annual report, as well as possibly a few other things like Reg G stuff if you have any non-GAAP measures, or some information if you've changed your auditor in the recent past. Then you have the second category of information, business and segment information. This is disclosure that's in your business section. See my separate Vid-Guide about that, a link of which is beneath this video, including the segments of your business. So you're going to have to segment out your business for purposes of your financials, for purposes of your MD&A, and for purposes of your glossy annual report. All right, the third category of information is stock-related information. This is pretty basic data: what stock exchange you're listed on, your ticker symbol, the number of record holders you have as of a certain date, your policy about paying dividends, and a stock performance graph. And see my separate Vid-Guide about stock performance graphs, a link which is below. The fourth category, information about directors and officers. This is pretty basic information, bare bones, bio information, the principal occupation and employment about the company's directors and officers. This is not the full-blown disclosure you see about directors and director nominees that's in a proxy statement. See my separate Vid-Guide about that, about full-blown bio disclosure for directors in proxies, and then also see my separate Vid-Guide about why an officer might not want to be deemed an executive officer. Links to both are beneath this video. All right, the fifth category is an undertaking to provide the 10K if requested by a shareholder. This is an undertaking is required to be provided in bold-face type, otherwise reasonably prominent, that the company will provide without charge a copy of the 10K to shareholders upon written request. This is an antiquated requirement, right? We have the internet now. The 10K is available up there, but perhaps there's some people that don't have a printer and want you to send them a copy, or you know those people. Some there won't be many of them, but someone might ask for your copy. Anyways, the company doesn't need to offer to provide all the 10K exhibits for free. Rather, it can elect to include with the free 10K a list of the exhibits, the index, and then provide the full package of exhibits if the request for a reasonable fee. This is all as is required in Rule 14A3B. All right, letter to the shareholders. So one of the most important parts of the Glossy annual report is a voluntary disclosure. This is not required, but it's typically the first item after you have the cover, the inside front cover, and then usually you have this letter to shareholders almost in every Glossy annual report. It's typically from the CEO or perhaps an independent board chair. Very rarely it's from the lead director if you have a combined CEO chair and there might be something special going on at the company. And the letter is usually a handful of pages, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it tackles, this is like a Warren Buffett thing where you're just like, what is the company doing right now? What it's in the near future, what its plans, what are its highlights, what topics are it's tackling that are hot right now for investors like sustainability or these days, COVID. So in that letter, it probably is going to tackle a number of different topics. Very important part of the Glossy annual report that is actually read. And then there's other voluntary disclosures. Besides the letter to shareholders, there might be things tucked in to show the company off, photos of a big new product, a new production facility, graphs of milestones, discussion of new corporate initiatives, nice photographs. This is where corporate communications gets to have a field day. You bring in some graphic designers and you go to town. All right, so let's look at some examples. Here's the inside front cover for Cognizant, and then the start of the letter to shareholders. Very nice job. And of course, their letter to shareholders starts right with COVID. This letter to shareholders came out in the spring, right when COVID was starting. And then this letter goes on for a full 4 pages and it ends with a full page picture of the CEO. It's very effective. And if you go flip through their Glossy annual report, there's 26 pages with graphics and slogans, including the letter to shareholders, until you get to page 27, and then you find out it's a 10K wrap. This is a sneak preview of my 10K wrap Vid-Guide, but this is what happens. You're having fun, you're enjoying this annual report, and then all of a sudden you get to the cover page of the 10K wrap, and it's, like, oh, legalese. Microsoft, here's an example, same thing, about 5 pages to the letter to shareholders. The CEO's pictures kicks it off in their online version of the annual report. And then Microsoft gets right into it. The selected financial data, the stock performance graph, the business section. Microsoft doesn't use a 10K wrap. It has a 10K that's separate from its Glossy annual report. The Southern Company, it also has a separate Glossy annual report from its 10K. Its letter to shareholders is from its CEO chair. And here is a picture right at the start of the shareholder letter. That's 2 pages. Page 3, you got financial highlights. And then you get to page 4 and you got these great composite pictures of the board, and there's a management council at Southern Company, and then a list of those directors and officers, their bare bones biographical information on pages 5 to 6. And then you get to page 7 and then you get a table of contents for all that nasty financial stuff. My guests today are Aaron Briggs of Gibson, Dunn and Candace Jackson of Mayer Brown. Aaron works in the San Francisco office and worked previously for General Electric for nearly 6 years. Candace is in Chicago and has been in-house twice, working for U.S. Foods in Primerica. So they both can bring that in-house perspective to their job, which I find to be so critically important in my job. I'm Brock Romanek, today on Zippy Point.
Quick Zips by Zippy Point.
Quick and dirty. So I believe this is probably the first ever programming just on the Glossy annual report. This is why I'm so excited to do these videos, because there's just not a lot of content out there, at least that I'm aware of. So thanks to Candace and Aaron for joining us again. This is actually a document that I enjoy, the Glossy annual report. It can look so nice and groovy. Aaron, can you explain the difference between filed and furnished?
Sure. So, to level set, I think it's important to remember that public companies have potential disclosure liability for pretty much everything that they put out there, whether it's furnished or filed or on the website or in the corporate Twitter account. You have potential liability under, Rule 10b-5. The main difference for documents that are considered filed versus furnished with the SEC is that the documents that are filed have potential additional liability because those documents get incorporated by reference into the company's 33 Act registration statements. And why that really matters from a practical perspective is that liability under the 33 Act is strict liability, and so it's easier for the plaintiffs to meet the burden, if there's a lawsuit. So the impact of this, varies a bit by company, just because that, if a company is not really in the public markets raising money, that distinction may be less important to, another company that's doing a bunch of follow-on offerings. And then you also have potential liability under Section 18 of the Exchange Act for, documents that are filed. And so I think the takeaway is really just to, it's good for a good disclosure counsel to do is, make sure you understand the difference and don't unintentionally, say that something's filed, if it shouldn't be. And so typically the Glossy annual report is furnished to the SEC, or at least under the old rules it was, and it wasn't something that was filed unless you specifically wanted it to be, which I think is rare.
Right now, there's a common practice is the 10K wrap, where you have the combined 10K and at least the four part of what was the Glossy. Well, you have everything that was it's supposed to be in the Glossy, but now that's in the 10K part, and then you have some of the letter to shareholders in the fluffy part. I have a separate Vid-Guide on 10K wraps. Check that out. Candace, what's been your experience about who takes the lead on the Glossy annual report? It's a document unlike these other SEC filings.
Yeah, well, it's usually not legal counsel. Typically the teams that are taking the lead, it's usually three primary teams. It will be your corporate communications team, your investor relations team, and your accounting and finance team. So, you've got your corporate controller group and the accounting group that are working on the financials and the financial information. You've got IR and CorpCom primarily working on, your CEO letter, your just kind of, the messaging, the corporate messaging in the annual Glossy report, and, any other information that's, included because it just is, part of the message that the company wants to get out to shareholders. Generally, though, legal counsel is involved and should be involved, especially just, making sure that, all of the basic requirements of the, the Glossy annual report are included, and, looking at things from a, Reg G perspective, from a, just material non-public information. Since this is not filed, you want to make sure that there's nothing material being disclosed that's not disclosed, in your K, or that's not, already out there in the public domain. So, the lawyers should be involved, but they're typically not taking the lead.
Aaron, other than the MD&A, how involved does a lawyer get with all this financial stuff, the numbers? I'm sure young associates get out of law school, come into the firm and think, okay, I can barely keep track of the law. Then they might find out they have to learn some accounting too.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's really easy for a disclosure counsel to say, oh, hey, it's the financial statements, that's the accountant's job, not mine. And so I'm not going to worry about it. I think that could be a mistake, or it could make you a bit less effective as disclosure counsel, right? Just because, these things all interrelate, right? And so things that happen or are disclosed in the footnotes are going to impact the disclosures everywhere else in the document, whether to disclose and how to disclose. It's also really important, as disclosure counsel, to have a good understanding of how the key metrics for the company and the non-GAAP metrics are calculated. That way, if you're in a disclosure committee meeting or you're reviewing the CEO letter, you have a sense for what some of the pitfalls are, how things are calculated when things have changed, if you need to talk about how they've changed. And so, this comes up all the time, on the CEO letter. So I think it's really important to, if you don't have a good, financial background, make friends with the folks in IR and accounting and financial planning and analysis, and, they can teach you all about how it works. And so, to be on a level playing field at the disclosure committee meeting is important. One more point on the kind of involvement of the disclosure council, in these documents. I think it's important to insert yourself early on in the process, right? It can't be a situation where they say, oh yeah, the CEO has already reviewed his or her letter, and so it's pretty much locked at this point. So,
Right.
for the things that Candace was talking about with non-gaps and, forward-looking statements and all of that, get in on the ground floor.
So Candace, what's the key to a good letter to the shareholders from the CEO or the board chair, in your opinion? What should be the goal of that?
Yeah, so the goal really should be for the company to tell its story, highlight its wins, highlight the areas that the company is delivering value to shareholders. It's also a great place for the company to tackle some of the ESG items that are really important to its investors. If there have been topics shareholder if there have been topics where the company has received shareholder letters, there's been a lot of shareholder outreach about those topics. It's a great place to cover the company's, priorities and wins with respect to those areas as well. But, the key really should be to just tell the company story.
Yeah, I think, recognizing that, not all of your investors will follow the company every day, especially retail investors and passive investors. I think this is a good place where you can give a 10-minute recap of, where the company's been and where it's headed. What were the key priorities for the year? How did the company do? And where is it headed from there? And then I think another key point is just to have authenticity or credibility in the letter. And so I think investors can really see through the document if it's just obviously a one-sided, overly optimistic marketing piece. Having some authenticity, I think, is important.
And so how do you feel, Aaron, about the other feel-good stuff that tends to be in a Glossy annual report when you have some charts and graphs that follow that letter to the shareholders that kind of give a snapshot of what the company's all about?
Yeah, the pictures are nice to look at usually. I think, they're often harmless and likely not material, less so when you're talking about the graphs that you're talking about. But I do think, as disclosure counsel, remembering that, there's potential liability. And so it's important that you have some sort of controls around all of the information that's getting put in the letter and the stuff around the letter. And so, do you have a backup binder? Do you have meetings with IR and PR and the accounting team to make sure everybody is signed off on what's going in? At some companies, the letter is controlled by marketing or PR, and it's a bit it can be a bit out there in terms of what they think the leadership wants to say, and so it's important to kind of think about, do we really have a basis to make these statements?
So we end with a question that's from the pre-internet days, that shareholders, you have to have a disclosure in your Glossy and report about shareholders being able to request a copy of the Form 10-K to get it mailed to them. So has anyone in recent years seen shareholders request a copy?
Never. Although we always have Broadridge, warehouse and send us extra copies just in case, right? But no, I've never seen a shareholder request a copy from the company of the 10K. It is on the internet. So.
Yeah, that might be the next disclosure simplification project.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.